It's Wednesday, and prisons are the only public housing the government is committed to building. I think I'm going to start off episodes with zingers that have absolutely nothing to do with the following episode. So, hello and welcome back to Colonial Outcast, the anti-imperialist podcast that your uncle who loves forever wars and needs a war of annihilation against Iran in order to cause an apocalyptic global conflict in order to bring about the second coming of Christ will absolutely hate the uncle that is like, oh yeah, mass famine and water and migration crises. Guess I'm about to get raptured soon. Yeah, he won't like this one because beyond the tit for tat strikes that happened this past weekend between the US and Iran, whatever the hell happened in the Iraqi green zone with tanks rolling through the streets over the weekend, and this completely unnecessary war started in frigging late February is still going on. It's been a massive strategic defeat for the U.S. thus far. We have become used to the rhythm of Trump sending out civilizational threats on Truth Social on like Friday, bombing over the weekend, then declaring victory in a negotiated path forward before the markets open on Mondays. Again, since February. And now in the latest cycle of BS, the U.S. and Iran are now in mediations with Qatar, days after this new round of attacks threatened efforts to sign a lasting peace deal. There have been a few developments today. They've met. We'll go over that here in a second, but this is not what we were talking about today, because we are joined by regular contributor Elina Xenophontos, geopolitical analyst coming to us from London. And Elina and I have done way too many interviews about this stupid war, and there's not much to say that hasn't already been said about the day-to-day news cycle. Like, I'm done. Like, I'm turning down interviews. And I was like, I've said everything. Nothing's changed. But we are going to be taking a different approach today with the central question: while Iran seems to hold maximum leverage at the moment, the government and internal politics are not united, and they are potentially, as Elina will illustrate, playing with fire. Are they negotiating their own slow defeat by entertaining the idea of opening up certain sectors to U.S. and Gulf capital or wherever? And we're going to talk about this. But first, we were going to do this episode yesterday, Elina, but she's had some technical difficulties. It's been quite the saga.
Yeah, it has been quite the saga. I think you've been on the receiving end of a lot of lengthy voice notes, tears, frustration, and rage all in one.
Yeah, you know, when you're kind of like doing this work and your computer dies, it's like, again, a civilizational threat. Like, it's bad.
That is actually a civilizational threat, and probably more potent than the Trump civilizational threats. Actually, far more severe in this case. Actual threats.
Yeah, so we're glad you're able to come in on your phone. The audio sounds great, and yeah. We're going to talk about it. Since we've relaunched the podcast, we're also going to, at the top of this episode, I'm going to break down, because I think we've got a lot of new faces around here, especially with the launch of the media platform. We're just going to explain what imperialism is, what the imperial playbook is for places like Venezuela and Cuba and Iran. The U.S. wants them to open their markets to private capital, and that kind of messes everything up. So we're going to highlight how that happens. And then Elina is going to take it and apply it specifically to Iran and why we've come to a dangerous place there. Looking ahead, tomorrow we have an episode with Jasper Craven. He's a journalist from The Intercept about God Forgives, Brothers Don't. It's about how the U.S. military culture has destroyed American manhood, tracing it from the Revolutionary War, through the Civil War, through the Second World War, and then Vietnam, when shit started getting real dark. And then here we are at the current moment, where you'll get guys like Pete Hegseth up saying stuff like this.
The government is going to fight decisively, not endless conflicts. Maximum lethality, not tepid legality. Violent effect, not politically correct. It's going to fight.
Violent effect, not politically correct. That is what I call Chat GPT poetry. And yeah, so we're gonna do a whole episode on that tomorrow for our society and culture episode this week. So hope to see you there. And because we live in this capitalist hellscape, we have to do a plug. We have just incorporated into a co-op media LLC, rfemedia.com. We're going to have a bunch of different shows, bonus content. The last 30 minutes of this episode will not be on YouTube or Spotify or Apple Podcasts, but go over to rfemedia.com and subscribe. It's going to be free for the next week or so you can see what you're going to get and decide if you want to subscribe and stuff and help us there. So, and if you're getting nickeled and dimed by this dystopia, if you like, share, subscribe, spread the word, and you can go to the Substack in the RFE Media LLC and subscribe. You don't have to pay anything. There will be occasional free content. So hope to see you there, and we really appreciate your support. So before we get into it, Elina, check out our new high octane bro sequence for the relaunch. Okay, send it. I can't. See, Mark likes this kind of corny ass stuff.
He does.
And, we just wanted him to have it.
Hey, listen, it adds character. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think it's very colonial outcasty. You know what I mean? It's the vibe.
Yeah, no. It was either that or one of the homies like pan-Arab hardcore punk bands from NYC. So, yeah, they're just they're friends, and we're gonna change the title sequence every once in a while and just get all our friends on. So anyways, guys, welcome to Colonial Outcast. We're going to talk about Iran. But first, I'm going to enumerate, just for everybody returning, refresher on like what imperialism is. And there aren't a lot of different playbooks in the imperial playbook. You try to sanction people, you try to mess with their markets, you try to threaten their individuals, do some coups and regime change. And if that doesn't work, straight up military invasion. Now, we know with Iran that military invasion is not possible. We've talked about it too many times. If it could have worked, it would have worked, and it hasn't. So, big picture, we're going to talk about, this is basically how I like to explain what imperialism is. Imperialism, there are many dictionary definitions, but for our purposes here, we're going to call imperialism an extension of one country by its authority over another territory. For this one, we're not really going to talk too much about capitalism, but it is an extension of that. So you'll have an imperial power, right? Like England or the United States, extending its control over another territory, which we will call a colony. History varies, experiences vary. Comparing British colonial rule of India to America is clunky, obviously, but all empires have a set of characteristics centered around three characteristics. Yeah, sorry. First is political control. Their abilities and mechanisms of control over their colonies have these. So first is political control, most frequently exercised by outright conquest and military occupation. But military control is also involved with local allies and collaborators. You got to have the collaborators. You got to make inroads into the government. I think we all know what happened with like Venezuela and how, the CIA, there's been some reporting that the CIA had been paying off bodyguards to the tune of like $50 million or something. I need to fact check it, but that story broke, as well as some Delcy Rodriguez stuff happening with there. So you got to have that, right? But military control is also involved with local allies and collaborators in an attempt to cultivate local elites using a combination of coercion and reward. And all of this is how empire exerts political and administrative control over a colony or a neo-colony, and now we're in a different age. We're going to talk about what that looks like. The second instrument of control is economic. The imperial systems, the economy of the colony serves the interests of the imperial power. This is different from territorial conquest, which all the friggin' white supremacists like to say that we won't do. So the wealth of the colony, its resources, and its labor is extracted and brought to the imperial power, the imperial core, and not used for the benefit of the colony or the nation that we're trying to subjugate, right? Or the people who live in the colony. In addition, these colonies were never really free to trade with other colonies of that power. We're still in the 19th century here. So we're talking about a very extensive level of economic control over the colony. And the third instrument of control is social, right? Social control includes things like language and education and the arts. And in most cases, the imperial power intended to suppress or destroy local culture and customs of the people. All universities and libraries and museums are destroyed in Gaza, for instance, saying that Palestinians aren't a people is a form of social control, saying that they had no identity before the colony and therefore the colony can do whatever they want to them. So, I mean, we're seeing that acted out right now. And there's also the imposition of ideas from the imperial power to the colony, ideas like racism, religion, capitalism. All of these were integrated into the structure of imperial control over the territory. And all of this has a profound impact. We call this like post-colonial legacy, i.e. for countries emerging into independence. And this is what Africa especially is like struggling with, in Latin America to a greater extent. So after having these colonies for so long, they immediately face, coming out of the colonial era, a whole set of challenges, which we are currently exploiting throughout the globe. So political challenges about, self-governance after colonial rule has expired over an intentionally divided socio-cultural landscape. Remember, divide et impera? It's one of the foundational things that we see even enacted today with different diaspora communities. So you got the Iranian fascist diaspora largely, and you have the people in Iran, which there's no political unity there necessarily in how we think of it. And there's the Cuban diaspora and the people who actually live in Cuba. So there's a whole, and you'll see like imperial propaganda platform these voices to manufacture consent in the diaspora for U.S. intervention abroad. So yes, they struggle with self-governance over an intentionally divided socio-cultural landscape. The colonizer playbook of divide and rule, economic challenges like how to develop their economies when their economic interests were tied to the imperial power for so long, all for so long in serving imperial power. How do we devise and set up an economic framework that will serve our interests as a post-colonial nation? So and from a social perspective, the post-colonial legacy has left behind an enormous amount of issues related to language, the role of culture, religion of these societies. So today, imperialism continues to cast a very long shadow in global politics. Imperialism. So now we are talking about the term neo-imperialism, which I don't want to get into because I personally don't think it's necessary. It's like the same stuff. I don't think imperialism has really changed or diminished all that much to necessitate a new term. I'll say that modern imperialism is less direct for it, like, the U.S. has bases all over the globe, right? But institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund do most of the colonial coercion these days, where you don't have to put like British infantry regiments on the ground in like Sudan or wherever, right? They are the international structures of control and hegemony. In other cases, it's multinational corporations, and this is with Iran. It's multinational corporations that exert imperial influence around the world. I think you could easily argue that liberal free market economics is a form of imperial control in and of itself. Anyways, that's my broad definition. Now that we're relaunching the channel, the most basic forms of imperial dynamics. And one of the things is like Iran has been cut off from these structures of imperial control, which has its own horrendous repercussions, right? There's like massive poverty. There's like the destruction of the middle class, which is the entire point of sanctions in order to do that, in order to have a popular revolution against the government, which outside forces like the United States intelligence services can shape and turn into what they want it to be. Now, the main thrust and the main subject of this episode is Iran has been able to exist for a long time under like total pressure sanctions. Now, part of this memorandum of understanding is they would potentially open up certain sectors of their economy to liberal free market economics, right? From like the United States and the GCC states. If you're new to this kind of stuff, the GCC states are the Gulf states. They're highly tied to the U.S. imperial agenda. We call them sub-imperial states. I think that's a correct terminology. And we wanted to discuss how, while Iran is in this very powerful political position with a bunch of leverage over the Strait of Hormuz, and the fact that they have massive military deterrence across the region, not because they have weapons of mass destruction, but because they can flood the zone with ballistic missiles and take out like every desalination plant in the Gulf and cause a massive, massive humanitarian catastrophe. They've established deterrence. They've got the Strait of Hormuz. The U.S. can't do anything militarily, but there are certain groups inside Iran, because it's just like any other country. No one's like agreed on everything. There was a rally around the flag effect while the bombs were falling, and there's still that, but there's a lot of disagreement in the government. We've never really talked about the Iranian government. It's incredibly complicated. And there's a bunch of different factions and power brokers, and then there's the IRGC, and there's the Ayatollah, and then there's the progressive wing or the reformist wing, like President Pezeshkian, all trying to figure this out. And there's a lot of dangers here, which Elina is going to enumerate on. But real quick, before we get into that, just some quick updates. Breaking from about 15 minutes ago, before you start, Elina. So the Iranian deputy foreign minister says meetings with Qatari and Pakistani officials in Doha have finished, and that no direct talks took place between the Iranian and American delegations. All right. He says that a communication channel, third party, will be open to report breaches of the MOU. U.S. Vice President Vance says negotiations are going extremely well, even though they're not in direct talks, but threatens that the U.S. has options if that changes. So Qatar's emir has met with U.S. negotiators Witkoff and Kushner in Doha to discuss the situation in Lebanon. That's going to be a big sticking point going forward. In Lebanon, President Joseph Aoun has defended Lebanon-Israel framework signed last week in Washington that was rejected by Hezbollah, emphasizing the text is not an agreement. So, and of course, 2 separate Israeli drone strikes have killed 5 Palestinians in Gaza amid all of this ceasefire violations. So, I mean, yeah, it's not an open conflict. There's still a lot of questions up in the air. Since you wrote this article, which we're going to pull up, which kind of went viral, which you entitled the $300 billion Trojan horse. The U.S.-Iran deal is a trap for Iran, China, and the axis of resistance. Has anything changed materially over the course of the week since you've written this?
Yeah, a couple of things have changed. I mean, the one major thing that I think undermines the memorandum of understanding that Iran and the US signed was the deal between Lebanon and Israel, which, yes, has been majority rejected, not even just by Hezbollah, but other political parties and factions inside of Lebanon, with the exception of a handful, and has faced a lot of criticism, rather ubiquitously in Lebanon. Yeah. And that agreement actually undermines at least paragraph 1 of the memorandum of understanding, because it was paragraph 1 that argued essentially that if Iran and the United States are able to come to a deal, by signing this deal, one of the conditions would be an end to all hostilities on all fronts, including Lebanon. And that, within the paragraph 1 as well, it actually sort of highlights not just an end to the hostilities, meaning that the Zionist state or Israel will essentially stop bombing Iran, but also it spoke about the sovereignty of Lebanon and its territorial integrity, in respect of its territorial integrity, meaning, and that's a very direct term, the occupation of Lebanon. So it was also looking to actually end the occupation of Lebanon as part of the general memorandum of understanding. So one big thing that has happened with the in the last week after the MOU was obviously the signing of the Israeli-Lebanon deal, because what that essentially did is that it completely undercut paragraph 1 that was agreed to by Iran, in the sense of most of that deal, which we'll get into as well a little bit later, but a lot of that essentially not only saw Lebanon, recognize Israel, but it saw Lebanon essentially recognize Israel's right to occupation or occupy its own territory, so long as its own security needs have not been met. It completely essentially takes away any state or non-state party from negotiating on their behalf or defending them or defending Lebanon without first getting the approval of the Lebanese state. So what does that mean? It means that it has immediately undercut Iran's ability to negotiate on Iran's behalf to end the war, to end the occupation. And it also undermines Iran's ability to defend Lebanon in the future of any further attacks by Israel, by the Zionist entity. So this was a big blow, because before Iran even had a chance to sit at the negotiating table, the United States with Israel went behind the scenes and established this negotiation with Lebanon. And what this will effectively do is that if Iran tries now to negotiate on behalf of Lebanon or to end the military campaign on all fronts, including Lebanon, it will be viewed as violating the Israeli-Lebanon MOU, as well as supposedly a Lebanese the Lebanese constitution itself, and that will be phrased within the Western international media that essentially this is Iran intervening in Lebanon's politics and treating it as a proxy and undermining its sovereignty, which is a narrative obviously we've heard many times throughout Western mainstream media. So that's the one thing that has changed, and there's a lot of things that can be said as well about the MOU that was signed with Israel. Between Israel and Lebanon, which we can get into. But that was one major change. But other than that, I think some other important things that have happened since is sort of the reaction within Iran itself. We're starting to see frictions frictions really between the supreme leader and the clergy, who also issued an open letter to the parliament with 10 major points that they are very adamant on. That would include obviously a non-negotiation when it comes to the nuclear, to Iran's nuclear kind of capacity, but also making sure that this is not the United States just essentially trying to buy time in order to guarantee further attacks. They expressed concern as to the way in which the enemy, as they would say, is trying to essentially use the MOU as mechanisms to buy time, and that they should not trust the enemy. There's generally been a general disapproval or like a lot of reservation within the religious sects of the Iranian parliament. Governance. Yeah.
In fact, just to remind everybody, like the Ayatollah himself, the new Khomeini, he said, I'm not like endorsing it. I have my own reservations, but if Pezeshkian and Arakchi and all those guys want to move ahead with it, and it fails, it's on them.
That's basically what he said. It's on them. We're not going to take responsibility for that. We're letting you do what you think you're going to do because obviously, they don't want to be perceived. And it's not. I mean, Iran's constantly kind of presented in the West as being this autocratic state, but it does have a very complex form of democratic expression and the way its political establishment works. There are frictions. There are oppositional parties. So they have to always strike a balance between this. So he is giving them that kind of ability. Okay, fine, we'll let it slide. But clearly there's opposition against the MOU from the get-go. And that is what the open letter that was signed by, I think it was 68, maybe, or 63, I can't remember, within the 60 range. I think around 63, between 63 or 68 members of the clergy had actually signed it as well. And it was very, very direct. And it did not filter at all in terms of how they view this MOU. So that I feel like is an important development, which it's going to play into obviously what we're going to talk about with regards to the article that I wrote and some of the, how this might play out. And obviously, the negotiations haven't actually even began to formally take place because we're already having issues. That being one of the central themes here is, to what extent, Iran's uranium enrichment and nuclear rights, so to speak, if you would like to put it in those right to nuclear energy, etc. And we saw even J.D. Vance, I think he was on Ben Shapiro, was it? I think I've been seeing clips of him on Ben Shapiro.
He has been doing the most insane media blitz to cover for what this failed operation. Like it's very clear that like the Trump administration is trying to make him the face of all of this, and he's just going along with it.
Yeah, he's going along with it. And basically what he said in the interview with Ben Shapiro, if I remember, because I did see it a day or so ago, or maybe it was just yesterday, but
let me see if I can get
I've been so stressed with the laptop situation. I think I'm losing track of the days. But I think he was basically saying that, if even the MOU doesn't guarantee future attacks against Iran, and this kind of does fall in line anyway with the general sort of pattern and sequence that we've seen the U.S. throughout the years in terms of how they operate and how much they tend to violate agreements that they make with other countries. There's been a long-standing sort of means by which sort of long-standing pattern. But beyond that point, it justifies everything that the clergy had also said and what the supreme leader has also warned about. And it goes to show that they've already undermined the MOU before it's even been signed, when you have, JD Vance going on media in the US and saying essentially, right, yeah, well, this doesn't guarantee we're not going to attack Iran again, when the whole premise is that we're going to stop intervening into each other's political, I guess, internal politics, and we won't be attacking each other. So, I mean, I think the major developments for me have been those kind of main three things in the context of the Israeli-Lebanon MOU, the fact that we haven't yet seen them sit down to negotiate because we're already having issues with regards to the uranium enrichment, and finally, sort of already seeing the clash and the contradictions within the Iranian political establishment, that being the clergy, and how they're responding to the MOU, and the fact that they're clearly not on board with it, and what that means for Iran, and how and to what extent that will allow this deal to even proceed, even from that angle. So I think these are going to be really interesting things to explore.
So when people hear like, oh, the clergy are against it, the assumption is like these are radical like Islamists who want to wage a war of annihilation against the U.S. and Israel. That's why they don't want the memorandum of understanding. But it's not the case. I mean, yes, there's a lot of hardliners and there's a lot of ideology, but like there are very, very like real threats to what's happening. We're going to do an episode on Cuba, right? And one of the big dangers to Cuba right now is because of the massive pressure of U.S. sanctions and maximum pressure campaign and the threat of military force on the island, there seems to be a political push which is not organic. It doesn't come from the Cuban people or the Cuban government even wanting to do this, but they have to liberalize their markets and open them up. And like that's the crux of your article, and it's the crux of a lot of this contention and consternation around this memorandum of understanding. So could you explain in the most basic way, I'm just kidding, why a country under sanctions, when the sanctions get lifted and their markets or their economy opens up to like foreign investment and development, just on the most basic level, why is that dangerous?
It becomes very dangerous because, look, this is the thing. When we're talking about, capitalism, when we're talking about capital, right, we also have to remember this isn't just a nationalist construct, right? Capitalism is a global economic order at this point, with the center of it obviously being the United States, where it's like, the world's financial center. It's also obviously the country that produces the world's global reserve currency, and it has like the world's, I guess the richest multinational corporations, finance companies, tech, etc., are located there. But it is an international network, right? So when countries begin to open up their country, as let's just take Iran here, for example, so we can sort of break down as well what I said in the article in itself. If Iran tomorrow was to agree and everything was to go through with the MOU, right? And again, this is conditional because even the MOU that they signed so far, right, just to be clear, they signed the first draft with the 14-point plan, but there's 60 days that they have to basically sit down the negotiating table and sort of draft out timeline for sanctions, agreements about their nuclear program, uranium enrichment, as among other sort of topics, and then they would sort of reach a conclusion. And so we're nowhere even near there yet. But let's just say this was to kind of materialize. Why this becomes dangerous. When we're talking about, for example, a country like Iran that has been, essentially cut off from the world economy for over 4 decades, since 1979. On top of that, Iran has faced multiple wars. We have obviously the Iraq-Iran war that went on for 8 years.
Which, we kind of gave a little nudge to start happening. And so
yes, the United States. They did give a little nudge to at that time their friend Saddam Hussein, but we saw how that went very quickly after that. So obviously, we had that take place, and then systematically over time, Iran has tried to build itself up, but whilst being cornered. And we also have to bear in mind that there was a point in time as well prior to the collapse of the Soviet Union that there were some relations and some sort of financial support and trade that was going on with the Soviet Union. But after the Soviet Union collapsed, Iran became even more isolated. And then we saw, like in 1995 and 1996, with the application of sanctions on oil, which was the bread and butter of the Iranian economy. And then eventually we saw secondary sanctions for the first time against Iran. And then in the 2000s, we moved forward into like the multilateral sanctions until finally, we saw in 2010 to 2015, we even saw the EU come in with sanctions. So Iran was cut off from the world, from the sort of the Western dominated financial order, which means that they didn't have access to trade. They didn't have access to the currency that they needed to engage in trade. It created scarcity inside the economy. It means that they have to try to become self-sufficient, so to speak. And it means that, Iran was severely restrained from developing. And it does, therefore, it does cripple an economy. We saw aspects of the impact of that in terms of the health sector in Iran, people having access to basic goods throughout the sanctions regime history. So now, when we're talking about the 300 billion basically entering into the Iranian market, it would obviously happen gradually. But what does it mean? It means that Iran, if was to go through the MOU, we would see initially, as per the MOU itself, we would see a lifting of the sanctions. It would mean that Iran would be reconnected back into the Western-dominated financial order, because you would need to do so in order to make way for the 300 billion in funds and that are going to go into the economy. And I want to make a note here, and something that I also said in my article. These are not reparations. This is an investment fund. And there's going to be an investment vehicle and mechanism put into place where the US and Iran will be jointly working together and collaborating on to monitor this fund. And there's a significant difference between, reparations or compensation, because compensation would mean that the United States is giving all this wealth to Iran to compensate them for years of economic warfare and damage, including the direct military attacks.
Hey guys, just real quick, if you haven't been paying attention for the past, I don't know, ever 250 years, it's our 250-year anniversary. U.S. doesn't do that.
No. Of course,
yeah.
And that's the thing that people have to understand. This money isn't going to be injected into Iran as here we're just compensating you, no strings attached. This money is an investment vehicle with major corporations, predominantly being, according to Reuters, American companies and Gulf companies, all of which belong to the same imperialist network and bloc, the same imperialist financial economic system. They're the ones that are going to be the main drivers in the investment that we're going to see in Iran. And so when we're looking at investment, we're talking about capital accumulation, increasing or finding new avenues for these corporations to make money. They're looking at making returns and basically embedding themselves financially into Iran. This is very different to compensation. And this matters because go on.
No. I mean, it matters. And just to go back to the intro explanation of imperialism, there is corruption in every government and every system and every economic system. But one of the ways of imperial control, and now instead of direct military force, we're going to see these multinational corporations take on that role. But control is also, quote, involved with local allies and collaborators in an attempt to cultivate local elites using a combination of coercion and reward. The reward being, hey, you want to get on this slice of the pie in the most basic level, and then being able to withdraw it if they step out of line.
Exactly. And that's what I was going to get to. So when your economy now, you're going to see all this wealth enter into the Iranian economy gradually, of course. You're going to start seeing major American Gulf companies and companies from the EU, et cetera, starting to invest in multiple different sectors within Iran. And now Iran is engaging in international trade, but through the Western financial dominated system, it gives the Western financial dominated system leverage over Iran. This is why we often talk about having economic sovereignty is fundamental to an anti-imperialist struggle. Because the moment you become economically dependent on the imperial core, they're then able to leverage that against you in order to discipline you. And in fact, that's actually the terminology that J.D. Vance used himself when he was discussing the MOU last week. He said, this will only materialize if Iran, quote, behaves. And this matters because when we're saying behaves, especially the United States, it means it has to fall in line with our foreign policy, with our interests. And the moment that Iran doesn't do so, and we've already seen J.D. Vance say this with Ben Shapiro, they will either militarily attack or they might just impose sanctions all over again. And the moment that Iran begins to get too comfortable, or the moment that Iran begins to become, set within the Western financial order again, then if sanctions are reimposed, it's going to have catastrophic impacts again on Iran. And just for, to put this into a bit of more perspective as well, when we're looking at what happened in the 1979 revolution, for example, the 1979 revolution, when the United States, immediately froze 12 billion during the hostage crisis, which equates to about 50 billion today, if not more, right? That's how much of Iran's wealth the US immediately cut off, which was a lifeline for Iran. One of the fundamental problems that happened from that point onwards, as the US started the whole sanctions regime on Iran, one of the major issues that they were facing is that it's the fact that due to the Shah, due to the neo-imperial control of Iran for years up until that point, Iran's entire economy, its oil sectors, its infrastructure, its assets were all, dependent on the West. And so when that was taken away, Iran had to struggle very severely, had undergone severe forms of poverty and hardship in order to begin to stabilize and find the means by which to manage their economy, which happened gradually over time. So to return back to a situation where Iran's economy becomes so dependent on Western imperialist capital means that they're going to put themselves back in that same vulnerability. And that is something that we need to be cautious about, because this is how neo-colonialism works. Neocolonialism, like you said, I think, earlier on, it's not the military and direct, occupation and control of a territory, but it is through exploiting financial control and leverage, by exploiting the global economic discrepancies between the global South and the imperial core, and using that as a means to financially and economically capture these countries. So this is what the U.S. is attempting to do with Iran, and
Venezuela and Cuba.
And yeah, of course, we would, of course, we're going to explore this in the episode where we're talking about Latin America and Cuba and Venezuela being two prime examples.
Coming next week. But yeah, the only point, I don't want to interrupt your flow, is like the imperial playbook doesn't have a lot of different plays, right? So you see these plans crafted in back rooms and stuff, and like on Wall Street or whatever, or like hedge fund world, where there's a lot of excitement about this. It's all tailored to different countries, to different markets, but structurally very, very similar across the board.
Exactly. And this is what the sanctions were meant to try to accomplish in the first place. Because somebody could turn around and say, well, why will Iran accept something like this? And there are several things that we need to consider. So, like we said, Iran has been sanctioned now since 1979. It's also gone through multiple different wars, including last year's 12-day war, and obviously the war that, the Israeli-American joint aggression, imperialist aggression against Iran. This is in addition to to October's the E3 having basically reversed or triggered the snapback mechanism that reimposed the multilateral United Nations Security Council sanctions on Iran, which had a devastating economic impact on Iran, which then gradually led to the protests, and we all know how those protests became hijacked, obviously by the intelligence apparatus of both Israel and the United States, in order to create the kind of discontent and supposedly gradually erode away at the government in Iran. So Iran, as it currently stands, has gone through one major war, whether it's economic war or direct military war, after another. And it would be foolish of us to not understand or admit that they have suffered economically at the very least. We know the 12-day war apparently cost them something like I don't know, was it 25 billion? I'm not quite sure. I think it was something along those lines in terms of damages. We know that obviously even the protests, we saw the protesters, a lot of them who were armed. Some of them obviously were compromised. There were genuine, legitimate protests, but we do know obviously that a huge chunk of them were also compromised. We saw how they were armed in a way and attacking civilian infrastructure, hospitals, schools, mosques. That is more destruction to property that the Iranian state is going to have to fix. And the war now has had obviously has taken economic toll on Iran. So when Iran is looking at its current conditions, then also considering the fact that the snapback mechanism has been reimposed, meaning that the United Nations Security Council resolutions, multilateral sanctions, which basically commit 193 countries to commit to, although Russia and China said that they won't because they consider the reasoning for the snapback mechanisms to be imposed to be illegal and illegitimate, and they are correct. That's a whole other point. They're correct to say that. This is the whole idea was to economically asphyxiate Iran to such an extent. And we've said this before on, you and I on these platforms and other platforms that we've spoken on, to then try to use that to create the conditions by which Iran will capitulate. Now, militarily speaking.
So I just want to make one point on this, like materially capitulated, they introduce, like foreign investment and capital into certain sections of the economy. This is what was going to happen under the JCPOA the first time, right? Basically, y'all, you can look into it. If you're like new to this stuff, it's the Iran nuclear deal that Obama put into place. It took forever. It was probably over negotiated in the first place, but it was somewhat reasonable, and it took a lot of technical experts a long time to figure out the exact minutia of the deal. Again, with this memorandum of understanding, they're not even in technical talks about what the nuclear program looks like yet. So I just want to quote from something, a book called How Sanctions Work. It's by Narges Baloghi and Vali Nasser and some others. This is from Maximum Pressure Fails Then Backfires. So Iran was initially shocked by the U.S. withdrawal from the JCPOA and its bevy of new sanctions. This was not because Iranians had a charitable view of President Trump's intentions. Instead, their disbelief came from their calculation that the United States would remain in the deal because it would be able to use the mechanisms of the deal, right, to exert pressure on Iran. By leaving the deal, Washington abandoned that advantage. So right now, with the memorandum of understanding, they're trying to get the JCPOA conditions back so they can actually exert pressure on it. And like a lot of people in the Iranian government know that's exactly what's happening. It's just so stupid they did it in the first place.
Do you know what I would argue? I would actually argue that the conditions of the JCPOA weren't as favorable to the United States because it did still give a significant amount of control to the Iranians as to how that capital would flow into the U.S. and so into Iran. And so I feel like to a certain degree, that's why the United States wasn't too happy with it. Now,
but someone would argue that some is better than nothing.
Yeah, I know. But right now, the way they're trying to approach it now is that, due to the economic pressure that's been imposed on Iran, all collectively, like between October and now, snapback mechanisms, mass protests, destruction, last June, 12-day war, another war now. This is a lot. This is a lot for a country. Like so much destruction to oil infrastructure, civilian infrastructure, that a country who's also sanctioned economically, being cut off from the rest of the world. I mean, they've sanctioned their banks. They have no access to the SWIFT system, which means it's going to be very difficult for Iran to be able to engage in international trade at all. And to financially even engage with the world. So it's going to be, these are the conditions that Iran is in. So when people are turning around and say, well, the Iranians know that this is this is obviously a trap, right? Of course, they can identify that there are issues, but there's several things that we have to consider. That being that Iran in itself has to look at its own particular material realities, and how this MOU, how this 300 billion can help alleviate some of that stress. But then you have to it's a very fine line, really a truly fine line that the Iranians have to kind of navigate here, because at the same time, you have to find a means by which to control how that capital goes in and make sure that you're able to subjugate it to their own kind of political control. For example, maybe retaining state control over a lot of their industries, so that Western capital, or a capital from the imperialist bloc as a whole, doesn't compromise your sectors, or you don't become so dependent on it that it doesn't it compromises your entire political establishment and your entire economic infrastructure.
It's just a slippery slope, and there's a lot of people who think like they've endured so long that they can resist it and there are systems in place, but like
it's difficult.
The one thing about capitalism is going to find the most corrupt motherfuckers to get in on
that's
it.
the other angle here, right? This is the other angle. So we've had this conversation before where we said that whenever the United States actually turns and attacks Iran, it creates unity within Iran. Even those that might be critical of the Islamic Republic or who are more reformist, they all come together because this becomes a matter of national sovereignty, as it should. They understand at the very least that they need to push back against the Western empire and the imperial power. So there is this unity that takes place politically and at the local and more social level. And I've often even said in the past as well, the sanctions war, the economic war on Iran, and the overall imperialist war in Iran even creates class alliances between the working class there and even the ruling class in Iran, which maybe, had they been left alone, we could have actually seen Iran evolve in a completely different way. But so the U.S. has understood that, we've seen how Iranians will back their state in Iran the moment that it's attacked. But when you start to step back, they've seen that the military method is not working. They fail to achieve to even destroy any of Iran's military infrastructure or nuclear sort of facilities and undergrounds.
They still have a navy too. Like they've lost some ships, but they still have a freaking navy.
Every time I hear Trump going about the Navy, but we've seen, they still have the vast majority of their military ballistic missiles, and the CIA report that came out. When was it? Was it 3 weeks ago? I can't remember when it was now. When the CIA report came out, and it was kind of we saw members of the Senate who had come out and essentially said that they said that Iran's capacity was pretty much almost fully restored militarily, and its nuclear bunkers, everything, not bunkers, its nuclear sort of underground warehouses. So the United States hasn't been able to move away from this operation against Iran and say that they've executed even any win, whilst losing most of their bases in the region, depleting themselves militarily, depleting their own stockpiles, which are already very thin, and weakening their own allies economically and militarily at the same time. So what are they going to do? The one thing that they have now is finance capital, weakening the fact that they've been able to inflict that harm on Iran, economically speaking, to try to use that as leverage to get into Iran, weaken it economically, abuse the fact that Iran does want the sanctions lifted, and it does need to have these sanctions lifted. The Iranian people do need to see an end to these sanctions warfare. But also in doing so, they understand that the political establishment inside of Iran is not this monolith that is often presented in the West, but it is a complex sort of hybrid political establishment between sort of has democratic factions and non-democratic factions. Obviously you have the supreme leader who sort of has like the final say in many ways. You have the clerical class, and there are sort of some like rigid kind of parameters by which even the political class can function within. You have the IRGC, who kind of pretty much has controls and the vast majority of the nationalized industries in Iran. And this happened as a reaction to sanctions, especially after the war, after the Iran-Iraq war. They needed to find mechanisms by which to quickly rebuild the country. And so the IRGC took that mission on. And now it's basically works and is affiliated with most of the subsidiaries inside of Iran. And then obviously you have the political parties, which are different. Currently in Iran, like you said, we have the reformists. The reformists are neoliberal advocates. The reformists have always been pro free markets. They've always been pro working with the West. And further negotiating with the West. Then we have the centrists who are more about economic management, but still, honestly, they are neoliberal advocates themselves. And then you have the hardliners. And something that's always important to note here as well is that in Iran, we don't have a socialist state, right? In terms of its political economy.
This is what I wanted to get into too, because when we talk about breaking Iran's anti-imperialist unity, I mean that's the extent of it. They don't want imperialism to happen to them, but beyond that, it's a completely different structure than like China or like Cuba or like what Venezuela was. So well, what we see and what we talked about before this episode too is like recognizing that like when you make these critiques about a government that's resisting U.S. imperialism, like when you start making critiques, like some people freak out. And it just really makes it hard to actually have a discussion about like what actual dynamics are at play here, and it can lead to a lot of blind spots.
Yeah, this is the problem, right? We need to be able to view things dialectically, and we need to be able to see them with nuance. We understand that Iran has anti-imperialist foreign policy, right? And we can support that within the context of preserving Iran's and its people's sovereignty and their autonomy as people, because the Iranian Revolution, the Islamic Revolution was one of probably the most popular in recent history in terms of like participation, right? So we have to recognize that practice of agency and the desire for the Iranian people to keep Western imperialism and control out of their country. That is very important, and that's why we have to stand by that. But at the same time, we cannot feed into delusions that, for example, Iran is an altruistic state and it's everything about its current sort of political landscape is perfect, and that we can't critique it, because then we're preventing ourselves from gathering the kind of information that we need to advance the anti-imperialist struggle and understand what the outcomes of certain things will be in a more accurate way. And this is why I brought up the fact that Iran is ultimately a capitalist economy. Yes, it's a more underdeveloped capitalist economy, but it's still a capitalist economy. And this is rooted even if you look at the 1979 revolution itself. Because the 1979 revolution, what we saw actually was mass participation and to overthrow the Shah. But there was an alliance. There was a unified front between the Marxists, the communists, and the Islamists, so to speak. And so they joined forces together. But make no mistake about it, the Marxists and the leftists, they were a major part of the revolution, and they had massive support bases in the major cities, especially amongst the intelligentsia classes, let's just say, in the cities of Iran. But for example, for other more the rural areas, that was a little bit different, and that's why when they overthrew the Shah, the Islamic aspect of the revolution and the leaders of the revolution started to kind of hijack leftist terminology, galvanized support, but then also kind of turned against the left at that time, but representing socialist ideas as being inherently Western and therefore also an enemy. So there's a lot of history there. I get into it in a whole other episode on Upstream, like the history. I know we don't have time to get into it now, but one of the main reasons that there was a difference between the Marxists looking to revolt, for example, and overthrow the Shah, and the sort of the religious class. The clergy, for example, kind of joined forces with the bazaar class, which is a very significant part of the ruling class in Iran at the time, to overthrow the Shah, because the Shah was bringing Western industrialization and Western imperialism, and he began to essentially try to push out the old elite and was establishing a new elite. And so their position, their wealth was being threatened, and that is why they overruled the Shah. And in fact, the supreme leader himself after the Islamic Revolution, openly stated, that in Shia jurisprudence, private property and wealth is a right of God, etc. And they codified the right to private property within their own constitution. So it is at the end of the day a capitalist economy. You could say it's a social democratic one because they do provide welfare, and they have to, especially within the sanctions war and what the impact that's had on their country. But ultimately, the reason I bring this up is that they do function from a self-interest perspective. They are not a socialist state that are looking to overthrow, for example, imperialism and establish a truly socialist state, and where the means of production, for example, will be for the entirety of the working class. There is a class contradiction within Iran itself, and this risks being kind of antagonized now with the MOU. And that's why I wanted to bring that up, that little brief history lesson, because with the MOU now, what I worry about, and of course you can tell me your thoughts on this as well, is that if this again materializes, right, and we can talk about whether it will materialize, is that you're going to see an influx of money into Iran, and that with that, all these foreign companies that could threaten the wealth and the status of that class. That's the one thing. Or it could even reinforce it. It could even reinforce that wealth. That's another angle, but then compromising it.
That's the smarter angle. That is the smarter angle.
But then there's the other thing. Even the RGC, who I said, for example, earlier on, the RGC has, basically, they control, like most of their subsidiaries control, like, telecommunications, construction, etc. As a consequence of trying to help the country stay afloat. A lot of RGC officials, like those in the highest ranks, have made wealth off of scarcity rents. Creating monopoly markets and black markets, because in a country that had scarcity of products because of the sanctions war, he who had access to goods, to resources, was able to exploit that and make money off of that, which a lot of RGC senior officials did. And obviously the same thing applies to those that have worked with, the black market, because, buying and selling and trading on the black market, which is how Iran managed to get by, created wealth for them. Now, as the sanctions will be lifted and this wealth is coming in, this jeopardizes the interest of some of these officials who may stand against it as well. And then, of course, there are those that are really pro, like the reformers who will support, re-entering the neoliberal financial world. And so the whole idea here, I think the United States is trying to either compromise the Iranian state or at the very least heighten the contradictions that exist in the Iranian state. And this is probably much more dangerous than the military war, and failure to critique Iran for this context or look into how the complexity of Iran actually doesn't allow us to see these dangers accurately.
Yeah. And also use them as a template for other theaters of conflict, again, because it's not that different. Like, we're doing an episode next week on how this is panning out in Latin America. And of course, cultures vary, markets vary, but it's the same thing structurally. Just want to say that one last time, because that's how it works. So also bringing in, I think we're going to put a pin in it right now for the regular episode, guys. So we launched this whole RFE media thing. We generally go for 90 minutes, but unless you're on the actual website, it's not going to have the whole 90 going forward, just because we're trying to grow the platform and stuff like that. And so this one's free. This whole launch week's everything's freebie, and you can get in for a $5 subscription now and be grandfathered in forever before things and prices rise. But we're going to keep going. Just keep in mind that that's eventually going to get paywalled. Sorry, we have to exist in in finance.
We're not
capital.
getting paid by mainstream media, so we just got to manage it our own kind of thing.
Yeah. So anyways, that kind of brings in for the next segment of the episode, China and the axis of resistance.
Oh, China. Yeah, we do need to discuss China. So, right. Something I wanted to say as well, but I don't know if you want to discuss that now. You can tell me.
Okay.
Because a lot of people also say, before we get into China, like, why would Iran, however, accept a deal like this? We've already established it for one angle, but we haven't. I wanted to get into as well why the United States, it is in their vested interest at this point to get an MOU as opposed to continuing the war. Continuing the war would not be the best option for the US.
There is no military solution. There's none.
There is none. And like, just to clarify, because people, one of the strengths that Iran's negotiating team does have, and I do want to highlight that, is the fact of what I mentioned earlier. The United States has weakened its allies that it relies on for supply chains or its tech industry, but also it relies on for the recycling of petrodollars to deal with its own deficit issues.
Yeah.
It's drained itself militarily, and it's also drained demilitarized significantly its own allies, particularly in the EU and even in East Asia.
Its sub-imperial states are really not happy, and they are actually better allies than Israel in a lot of respects. And so,
they actually are. So this is something that Iran could use to its favor on the negotiating table. And like, one last thing.
I'm sorry. Okay.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Say
your however. No. Say your however, because this point can wait.
Okay. No. But yeah, they're better allies, and that gives Iran a lot of leverage. However, a lot of these these GCC states will be like, wow, we do not want to see this war kick off again. And one of the ways to forestall foreign conflicts, if the U.S. is not a reliable negotiator or a good faith actor, is to entwine our economies together. Between Iran opening themselves up to the GCC money and the GCC money getting some assurance that they won't get attacked again if Israel does something crazy or the U.S. reneges on its negotiation position. So they have a vested interest in some ways of seeing this MOU go through. So it's kind of like a threading the needle type thing where, yes, Iran has this leverage, but also, there's a lot of players that have a vested interest in making sure it goes through, but not necessarily to the benefit of Iran in the long term.
Exactly. And that's what the negotiators in Iran have to really tread lightly with here, because they do have negotiating leverage. Theirs is the Strait of Hormuz, how successful their military campaign was, and how they basically kind of disrupted the entire global supply chain in a way that was had significant economic repercussions on the imperialist financial frameworks and structures and trade. So this is a major advantage for Iran. However, like I said, for the U.S., its advantage would be that Iran is in a dire economic situation. It's been able to buffer the impacts of it, but not indefinitely, and it will struggle. So alleviating the sanctions, which is a stated goal, even of the clergy, even of the supreme leader, is fundamental to them and their own economic survival and their ability to develop and grow and become more powerful to be able to push back against, Western intervention rather than becoming even weaker. So this is the two-way road right now, which is why I do believe that there's going to be an effort to try to get an MOU, because it doesn't really benefit anyone continuing at this point. And that's just the point that I wanted to draw to clarify, because some people were saying, like, we're presenting it in a very one-sided way. No, the United States also has had losses in this, military, economic, and in terms of its own allies and its reliability as a state.
So is Israel, but that's a whole different conversation. But like, there's so much ideological insanity, reactionary insanity happening there right now.
Yeah, Israel is. I think the whole thing with secure, I think it was a major mistake. It was pretty slick what the U.S. and Israel did with the Iran-Israel deal by undercutting the Lebanon-Israel deal by undercutting the agreements made with Iran, which is another reason why the Iranians might not want to negotiate. I mean, you've already went behind their backs before they even sat the negotiating table on top of everything else and made these agreements between Lebanon and Israel, which now can't even guarantee the axis of resistance. And that's what we can get into that now, because like the other angle here is to like try to fracture the axis of resistance as well.
So we'll get to China last, but let's do axis of resistance now. Just a quick history lesson. After it was cut off from sanctions and after a bunch of devastating wars and this complete narrative that Iran is this post-revolutionary state about to fall. And that's why we just need one more push. Like during the global war on terror, we invaded Iraq, and then you had people in the White House, all the neocons like Wolfowitz and Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney being like, you know what, while we're over there, why not do Iran? And so like they were next on the target deck, and it was a published target deck too. Of course, militarily, the U.S. High command basically said that was not feasible. We don't have the manpower unless we go to like World War II levels of freaking shit, which we can't do because we're deindustrialized. But Iran knew that there was going to be some interventionist fuckery happen, either through intelligence operations, special operations and stuff, to collapse their government. When we invaded Iraq, which was insane, they immediately, and we overthrew the government, and we kind of like dismissed most of or a lot of Iraqi military units. Well, those guys were like, okay, well, fuck this. We're all joining like sects and different like armed militia groups. And that's when Iran got involved in the war, because they wanted to bog the United States down in Iraq through low-grade counterinsurgency efforts by like training Shia militias and advising different sectarian groups, and also inventing and coming up with the EFP, explosively formed penetrator, which was an IED that used copper bolts to chew through tanks. We think that came from the Iranians because they didn't want to get attacked. And like, this is such a controversial topic amongst like military circles that I live. It's the truth, right? And so we can see that like the axis of resistance comes from that same thing. It predates the Iraq war, obviously, with like Hezbollah and other groups. Of course, when the media talks about the axis of resistance, they paint it like all the same brush. Iran has the same relationship with Hezbollah than they do with Hamas. And no. First of all, like completely different relationship with Hamas. And there's like not as much military cooperation, and there's not as much like direct military or political influence they can have over Hamas and replace like with regard as opposed to a group like Hezbollah, right? But the reason they've created these networks is in order to counter imperial power projection in the region and the domination of the Middle East. Because without these groups, they'd be kind of isolated, right? That's the most basic premise of why invest in the axis of resistance. And say it's like a first line of defense in a lot of ways. And it's a way to bog down enemies who want to essentially attack you and overthrow your government. And so if they think, and this is one of the dangers, that they're now in a position where they don't need it anymore, I don't actually believe that's the position. But if Hezbollah goes down and is isolated, that's kind of like the beginning and the end, because the Houthis are kind of like doing their own thing. You have like the rapid response forces, the Kataib Hezbollah and the PMU in Iraq, but they're not necessarily as effective or organized or committed. So that's kind of like an existential military threat, especially what's happening in Lebanon with the ongoing effort to expand U.S. military influence over the Lebanese armed forces and to work with Israel in order to demilitarize Hezbollah. And if that happens, the south of Lebanon's gone.
Oh yeah, 100%. And that is really it. So when we're talking about the axis of resistance, like you said, the axis of resistance, has been successful in preventing the complete imperialist domination of the entirety of West Asia, because it's always been a pushback, essentially, due to these resistance factions existing and collaborating together. And like you said, they're not all one monolith. They were all born out of different forms of occupation and resistance, and then they formed an alliance. Essentially, it's what it is. And they do receive quite a strong kind of military and political and economic backing in many ways to Iran, because Iran in of itself understands the significance of weakening imperialism within West Asia, and especially within the Levant region, because the more surrounded they become, then the weaker, or their ability to repel, let's just say, Western imperialism will be. So the axis of resistance is fundamental to preserving the sovereignty of West Asia so far as is possible, to disrupting and frustrating rather the imperialist desires together to, even establish economic corridors and trade routes, et cetera, which we'll get into afterwards with China within the region that could empower, alternative power structures there. Think about how, the United States.
Yeah, and they're super effective. The United States has proven time and time again, decade after decade, that we're really incapable of snuffing out any sort of non-state asymmetrical actor.
Yeah, and that's the important aspect. This is why the acts of resistance has been so incremental to the sovereignty of the region and even to Iran. And so part of this MOU as well, when we're talking about maybe even to a certain degree compromising the state and what, Iran has to be very careful as to how it's going to negotiate going forward, is that if you've compromised the head here, right, if you've compromised Iran, or, if you've created a financial economic dependency or start to impose some sort of economic, influence on its major infrastructure, the idea is to try to compromise them to such an extent that it will try to, weaken the relations between the axis of resistance. That's one thing. But on the other hand, as well, beyond all of that, is the fact that, it's the axis of, by weakening the axis of resistance more broadly, they're able to implement their overall plans. The same thing can also be said, by the way, with regards to like the Strait of Hormuz, which is another point that I quickly wanted to bring up, because a lot of people say, well, one of the major wins is that the MOU has granted Iran the ability to do what it wants with the Strait of Hormuz. But I wouldn't. But yeah, I'll be very cautious with that. It says not Iran, but the coastal states as a whole, including Oman. That's the first thing. And second of all, with regards to that, if you compromise Iran, then how they operate the Strait of Hormuz is already compromised as well. Like, that's the other angle behind it. So that's why it's very important to make sure that Iran as a state, as a country, is not compromised by Western capital. And bear in mind as well that the MOU, with all this money going into Iran, if Iran becomes dependent, and like I said, you cannot trust the United States or the West to use that financial kind of dependence on by reintegrating Iran to the Western financial system again, they could easily pull the plug, for example, if Iran continues to provide support to resistance factions within the region. So again, it creates the incentive to fracture the axis of resistance. And this is another angle, this is another thing that they're trying to do through the MOU, which again, Iran has to be very tactful about. This is why Iran must make sure not to allow this 300 billion, but it's not just the 300 billion. You've got the lifting of the sanctions and the frozen assets that are going to be returned. That's a lot of money that they're trying to entice Iran with right now. It's a lot of money. They've got to make sure that they're not have their anti-imperialist ethos in that way compromised to such an extent that they allow that money to go in uncontrolled, or to a certain degree, or to have weakened control over it, which is what the US would like, which in turn then could weaken its ability to even support resistance factions, or create the incentives for them to think, right, it's just not worth it anymore.
Yeah, we don't need it. Like, we now have a better relationship, maybe in some fantasy future, the United States will be able to like reel in Israel. And then because of our economy with a freaking population size of 90 million people and a bunch of natural resources and a geographical strategic advantage, we would eclipse Israel in the region. Like, that's some of the dangerous thinking potentially. And then of course the US wants to really foster that, because all of this, there is so much from a military perspective, so much discontent that we are now engaged, especially in the defense sector in Washington, like so much frustration that we're engaged again in West Asia. A lot of people didn't want this. A lot of power brokers were like, yeah, we have been promising to move on to China since like 2005. Like, what is happening? We've had like readiness orders to prepare for a 2028 confrontation with China potentially over the Strait of Taiwan. This needs to be ended, and there is no military solution. So I would say that this is kind of the smart play.
That's what I would say, that, this is what I always try to tell people in sort of the discussions I've had up until this point, is that Iran, yes, has its own, issues to contend with, and like I said, the economic related issues and having to lift the sanctions and, this is a lot of money that they're being enticed with, and the future of its people and its welfare of its people. Obviously, that's something that they have to consider, and they have to be careful of the different political and factions and the different incentives within their own establishment, which is not a monolith. The United States in itself, like I said, it has a lot of reasons to want this to come to an end, if it's looking towards not just come to an end, but to try to compromise Iran in whatever way that they can. And that's the way. Now we can come into China here. One of the things that, having huge amounts of capital coming from the imperial court into Iran would be to slowly try to not replace China, because China will still be an investor and an economic partner. It is the world's, industrial powerhouse. And this is a matter of fact. And there's already outstanding major billions of dollars worth of economic trade agreements that have been made between China and Iran, including, Iran plays a very significant central road. Was one of the central core, nodes to the Belt and Road Initiative, which is fundamental for China's own economic sovereignty. But also for the digital Silk Road. So there's a lot of money that's been put into Iran, and gradually it's been agreed to between China and Iran. So that can't just be replaced. But by, I guess, infiltrating Iran to even a certain degree, they're going to try to find ways by which to sway that kind of relation away from China, even so far as is possible, to try to break the China-Iran relations, or to weaken them, or to provide more incentives for Iran to fall further within the American sphere of influence. And this is something that, again, we have to consider, because when we're talking about China, when we're talking about the Belt and Road Initiative, and this is something I obviously spoke about in my piece as well, the whole incentive as well behind the Belt and Road Initiative, among many, there's many reasons, but one incentive as well is to kind of break free from the Strait of Malacca and the stronghold that has over the Chinese economy, because 80% of its trade basically flows through there. So China is looking to broaden its trading capacity, basically, through different avenues and routes. You've got the Arctic route, you've got obviously going through Iran, the sort of the China-Pakistan corridor, but a lot of these other routes, like the Arctic route, is still, we're still many years away from that. Obviously,
gotta have more shit melt, bro.
Yeah, let's just have some more things melt, which is definitely not what we want to be talking about. But then the others, obviously, the China-Pakistan corridor, which has its own, issues due to the Balochistan kind of territorial disputes and terrorist attacks, and it's just generally an unstable area. The same thing applies for, we're also, even the tensions between Afghanistan, et cetera, and Pakistan, that's also worsening the situation. So these are very unstable locations in terms of establishing the BRI. And this is a project that China's invested over $1 trillion in. Iran is a major country. It's huge. It connects the East with the West, with Africa, with Europe, like we've said this before. It's got an abundant amount of resources in terms of oil, which was also very important to bring up here, because what does that mean for the petrodollar? I'll get into that in a second. But Iran is such a geostrategically significant location and part of the Belt and Road Initiative, that to try to disrupt it, or to try to enter Iran economically and try to sway it out of that sphere of influence could be, issue a very major blow to the multipolar project, if you like, and to China. And I think this is one as well of the major objective. If you can't beat Iran, maybe provide them with greater, give them make them an offer, a deal that they can't essentially refuse, or try to help alleviate the economic stress that we've put them in by giving them a lot of money. And then the other angle here as well is obviously the petrodollar, right? And I think in some of the other episodes I had actually said that prior to obviously the loss of Venezuela as well, China, Iran, Venezuela, and China, Iran, Venezuela, and who else now? Oh, God, Jesus Christ. China, Iran, Venezuela. Jesus Christ, my mind's gone a bit blank.
Oh yeah, this is. I've been in like 3 hours of recording.
China, Iran, Russia. Yeah, I don't know what the hell. I've also gone a bit blank there. Together, they basically had around 30 32% of the world's oil reserves, right? Collectively. And if they had established, and they were moving towards establishing, obviously, alternative payment systems and mechanisms and paying in their own currencies in these vital kind of fossil fuels in the exchange of, gas and oil. And what this would have actually been even a greater threat to the United States and the petrodollar, because, as I said before, the Gulf states, the Gulf countries on their own collectively made up like 29% of the world's oil reserves. So though that says something, right? Especially when you've got countries like even Nigeria, which is another oil-rich country, is also part of this BRI project.
Oh, yeah,
and
we've talked about that, and we've talked about like AFRICOM intervening in Nigeria. Of course,
we've discussed it. This is the other thing with Iran and the petrol and the oil, and sort of infiltrating its economy, is trying to as well maybe see if they can secure the petrodollar by bringing in their production, their sailing of oil under the dollar, for example, and weakening any sort of ability to kind of move away from the dollar. So these are some of the things that the United States is trying to do through, I guess, corporate capture, which is just neocolonialism. This is what the West always does, through the IMF, through the World Bank, through their private, financial institutions. This is how they infiltrate, or SWIFT, through major multinational corporations and equity companies buying out, and for them, that's another avenue for profit maximization, right? To deal with their own capital accumulation crisis. They try to destroy Iran's economy, and then when you go in, there's so many investable opportunities, which will keep their own stock market value and market capitalizations up, therefore salvaging the American economy at least for a little while longer. So these are all some of the things that they're trying to do. Yeah. I'm not saying it's going to succeed, right? But what I'm saying,
but it is a danger that not a lot of people are really talking about.
Yeah, I just think it's a mistake to constantly say, Iran won this. It's all good. They're getting everything. They're getting compensation, everything. They get this.
The MOU's not going to go through because Israel's going to sabotage it no matter what. I don't think that's a good read on the situation either, because the Trump administration seems to be putting actually more and more pressure on the Israeli government at the time, at this time right now, because they want this to happen in some ways. They want this to happen, so
they need this to happen. And like we already saw with I said the whole Lebanon-Israel deal already kind of screwed over Iran from not allowing them to end and terminate the war on all fronts and protect Iranian sovereignty, which creates a problem for the axis of resistance, right? So that's how the U.S. tried to rectify that, whilst providing prophylactic measures for Israel to do what it's going to do. It's like, well, you can't speak on behalf of Lebanon anymore because Lebanon signed so and so with Israel. It's given, and I think we don't have time for it now, but we should do I really want to do a whole episode on that Israel-Lebanon deal, because it was insane. I mean, they've even gone above and beyond the resolution 1701 by a lot, above and beyond.
Well, maybe we
handed their country over.
Yeah, maybe we can do that this month. Something that people don't really understand, and like that are trying to like get into like the whole geopolitical mess, which takes a long time to cultivate a knowledge base. It's just like looking at the patterns, the structural mechanisms by which we try to control and dominate other countries. We're now in an era where, U.S. military power, which is not the entirety of hard power. Hard power is also economic power, still exists. And, they're both declining. The military power, I think, is declining faster than the economic hard power, but like we still have so much inertia behind us. So like we can talk about dying empire stuff all day, but it's like, yeah, but not yet. This is going to keep going. Yeah. This is going to keep going for a long time.
And that's why we have to be very diligent. And that's why I say we shouldn't just be, Iran won everything and it's all going to pan out. And we also equally shouldn't say, this isn't going to pan out and the war is just simply going to continue. I'm like, sure, it may. However, for both of them, for both the US and for Iran right now, and for American allies and for the Gulf states, it would be preferable to try to hash this out, even for a period of time. And by period of time, I don't mean a few months, but like enough time to, yes, balance out the economy, try to implement some sort of mechanism by which to disrupt Iran internally. And that's why I said Iran has a very long path ahead of trying to negotiate right now um, an agreement with the US that's going to, yes, bring capital into the country and the sanctions, because yes, we do support the end of the sanctions on the Iranian people, of course, but not in a way that's going to subordinate the country. We need a leadership that can subordinate that capital to their own interests and not be compromised. But then the problem is that there are, like we said, there is a bourgeois class in Iran, and there are fractures and there are different ideologies. This is not China. This is not a one state party country with a clear, I guess at the very least, socialist agenda, trying to establish a pre-socialist state. And they're very and they're kind of like the disciplined ideology that goes with it. In fact, the ideology of Iran is openly, as per their own constitution, a protector of private capital and a capitalist economy. So these are just things that we should be wary of, without undermining. We're not undermining, I would say, what Iran has accomplished. In fact, if anything, that's what gives them the leverage that they currently have to try to be as smart about this MOU as possible.
Yeah. So we'll keep watching and waiting and seeing. So yeah,
that's what we do. Our job is just to sit there and observe.
Well, thanks. You made my job easy today, because I was just gonna I just interviewed you about your article. So hells yeah.
Definitely had a big input, man. You definitely, you know your stuff, so it's all good. You always have something to say.
I just switched roles because I was the interviewer on the last one. So I love talking about like the toxicity of U.S. military culture. Like it's, you know what? Oh, sorry, my phone's talking to me. Like at the beginning of it, I just want to mention this. Seth Harp, he's a great journalist who wrote the Fort Bragg cartel. He's just like how militaristic educational institutions like the West Point, the Citadel, Valley Forge, ROTC, and even the Boy Scouts warp and distort the psyches of men and boys, stamping out truly manly qualities like optimism, warmth, amity, and honesty, and independence of mind to create, for the benefit of an immoral government and capitalism in general, I added that, obedient legions of servile and emotionally stunted hollow men afflicted by anger, shame, loneliness, and despair. So if you're banging the war drums on this, you're that guy. So
you're that guy.
Don't be that guy. So yeah, that's what we're looking forward to tomorrow. So
yeah, when you said it in the introduction, obviously like that's what you guys are going to be working with. So I'm like, that sounds very interesting. I feel like it's an angle that people don't, we don't discuss nowhere near enough, and it definitely plays a role, especially when you're talking about it's
also
muscle.
like we're not just doing these episodes to keep people informed. We want to like change people's minds, and like some guys are just so far gone. They're mostly ICE officers. I'm just kidding. You're never gonna reach them, but like we have to understand how to like talk to our audience, because that's the work.
No, I agree with you. I think, I think one of the observations I've made recently, because a lot of things have happened. This is why I feel like I was probably speed talking. So I had so many things I was trying to cover, but like you can't cover everything.
No.
One of the observations I've made in the last few weeks, especially with the whole MOU in Iran, everything, actually in the last few months with what's happened in Venezuela and what's currently happening in Cuba, is sort of this reluctancy. It's sort of like you have to take sides, and then the side that you're on, you cannot critique it and you cannot analyze it. But as if you do, that makes you any less supportive of their struggle. And what people are missing is that we are here to try to educate. Ultimately, like you said, to give people the tools to help people understand the complexities of things on multiple different levels. Because that's the only way forward. We can't, because how the hell are we supposed to assess a situation, for example, accurately, if we're just choosing to evade mentioning some important points? Like, of course, like with Iran, it's capitalist economy.
This is a good lesson to like not wrap your identity around a state or a government and like attach that to like you. Because that's what like MAGA does too. It's like
this is the thing. Like, people don't realize actually this is a very it's very liberal identity politics. Like we're moralizing these things, and it's coming even from like Marxists, especially in the West, which is quite interesting to observe because, you know, like I have my concerns. Even we're obviously going to talk about it next episode with regards to Cuba's reforms, and I understand why Cuba's reforms are happening. I feel for what the Cuban people are going through. I mean, it's essentially like a genocide that they're, you know, like people are suffering, like children are dying, like, you know, as you're the Cuban leadership, like what the hell are you supposed to do in that scenario? It's a very, very difficult decision. I don't want to be making that decision.
Yeah, didn't the president put out like socialism's about like justice, but you can't have justice when everyone's like freaking starving. So
yeah, I understand that, right? But like for example, some of the conversations is sort of along the lines of, you know, I've said that some of these reforms are quite dangerous because they're going above and beyond like the China model and the Vietnam model. They're happening at a far faster pace for a smaller economy. And, you know, it risks creating the conditions for capitalist corporate capture of Cuba again, in a way that threatens the socialist project. And just saying that alone was like, oh, you know, you're not a Cuban, you're not this. And this is coming from Marxists who would otherwise have called this a liberal kind of trope to, you know, reject critical thinking, are doing the same thing now because we cannot have a conversation about our fears and concerns and critically assess what's happening in the camps that we support. No, but we're critically assessing it because we support them. We're not against them. We're saying we understand why they're doing what they're doing, right? But we need to have a clear mind. That's the Marxist way anyway, at least for me. It's about critiquing.
You know, again, like going forward, we're doing a society and culture episode every week here on Colonial Outcast, not just the geopolitical stuff. We are, hopefully this month, we can get on this Marxist anthropologist that's going to talk about like the psychology and the problematic-ness of like a lot of Western leftists. Do you
have someone in mind? Or you don't want to say yet?
Yeah, I can't say yet because there's two. I'm seeing who's available.
All right, you could tell me afterwards.
Yeah.
It'll be in the after chit chat in the green room.
Yeah, in the green room. All right, guys. I'm friggin' tapped. Thanks so much for watching, and we're glad to have you on our new platform. You know, at the risk of sounding like an annoying local band who's never going to make it, big things happening soon. All right. Cheers, y'all. Yeah, I'm going to be linking Elina's article in the description. Make sure you check it out. Bye.